because obviously we're already talking about good things. Elvis, how you doing? Welcome.
Good. Yourself? Welcome. Pleasure to be on the Courage podcast.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have a chat with you. And I've always followed you online, and I was a big fan of you before I even started fighting. And I even dropped into your gym only once on holidays, but that was very early on there in Liverpool, because that's where my parents were.
Back in the
living
back in the day.
We've
known each other for a long time through the sport and the community here. And you were out here not too long ago in our new facility, Kings, doing that jiu-jitsu seminar not too long ago as well. So it was good to have you back down for that.
Yeah, that was awesome. Now, I think I love a good origin story, right? And people forget real quickly, like we're moving on to the next shiny object. But you fought all over the world and all over the place doing ADCC before 90% of the population that are training now even knew what ADCC was. So could you give us a quick rundown of how you got started in martial arts and kind of where you ended up now?
Well, I'm going to give you a disclaimer. There's no such thing as quick when it comes to me. I tend to waffle a lot. I've been around for a long time. I do have CTE, so stories will just come out of anywhere. Like I'll start wandering off, so be prepared. You may have to edit afterwards. So I started back in the day. I got into martial arts because of Bruce Lee, and I think a lot of people from my generation did. Obviously, he took the martial arts into the big screen, so I started looking it up. I actually started in judo, interestingly enough, because it was the only martial art that was around and it was suitable for my parents to put me in and put the kids in the evening to do the classes. And then from judo, I discovered Taekwondo because it was more striking, more kung fu like that Bruce Lee was doing in the movie. So I did Taekwondo for quite a few years. And then kind of when I got through uni, I did it. And then when I graduated, I started working. And while I was working, I met one of my old high school friends who was a karate person back in the day when I did the Taekwondo. And he goes, "You've got to check this out." Hands me a VHS tape of UFC 2. This little skinny Brazilian guy choking out all these big monster dudes. And I'm like, oh, this is very interesting. And then so I started looking into that, discovered Blitz magazine, which had John Will traveling out around the world. And he was, wrestling in the pits of India, doing Salat in Indonesia, and then traveled to Brazil to train with the Gracies. And that's where he discovered the Machados. So I kind of discovered that. And then I kind of linked the two together. I found a Jun Fan school, which was like a Bruce Lee style school, but they did the stick fighting, the Muay Thai, and they did a little bit of grappling, which from the Dan Inosanto Machado sort of lineage.
Yeah.
That got me quite intrigued. And then so I started looking a little further, discovered a school in Sydney. At the time, I was playing beach volleyball, so it was the perfect opportunity. I used my IT career to move up to Sydney because I'd met a girl while playing beach volleyball who was doing school in Sydney. So I moved up, started working for Microsoft up there, was playing beach volleyball at Manly, and I discovered Anthony Lange, also one of the pioneers of jiu-jitsu, who was training under John Will up there in Sydney. So I started training with Mr. Lange in Manly, kept training through that. From there, got more and more into the UFC through tape trading, which is kind of for the people around today, you wouldn't realize the sport went through a really tumultuous period where it was almost banned. It was people were trying to shut it down. It was, they were selling it as brutal cockfighting and all this sort of stuff. So the way the sport stayed alive is a lot of the fans would record events and trade them around the world. So you would trade. I'd buy an instructional series video from someone, then I would make a copy and I would send that instructional to someone in the US who had a copy of the UFC, who would send it back. And then I would send that to someone in Europe who had another instructional. So they'd send me their instructional for a UFC. And it kind of kept going for a few years until a promoter brought it to Australia. He initially called it the Australasian UFC. And later, he later got sued by actual Zuffa, the UFC. So they took the name down. When it got released on VHS, it got released as Caged Combat 1. So I fought in that, the first ever event. That's where I met Mario Sperry, who ended up winning the event. From that event, I met a few people like Larry Papadopoulos and a few others who was fighting in Shudo and Krista Weaver. Some of the old school names back then. I kind of continued my training in the jiu-jitsu, the MMA. Then I was really getting into grappling, and the ADCC decided to have their inaugural event, ADCC World Championships in Abu Dhabi. I applied for it, and a bit like my first time when I applied for the UFC, the Cage Combat. When I actually applied for it, they've gone, no, sorry, you don't have enough experience. You're not a name. You're not going to be able to fight in it. I went, look, no problems. Here's my details. And I literally called the promoter every single day to see if a spot had come up. And quite literally, fighters started dropping out like flies because there was a lot of kickboxers and boxers and stuff who were initially entered in it, but as they kind of started discovering what was involved, I think they started doing their research. They started going, whoa, this is not really what I'm ready for. And so about 2 weeks before the event, a spot opened up, and then I jumped in and I fought. And then pretty much the same thing happened with the ADCC. I applied, and they said, look, even though you're, the only Australian MMA fighter they knew about, there was a lot of big names that were interested. And the same thing happened as they got closer to the event. A lot of the jiu-jitsu people, because they hadn't done a lot of no-gi, and there was, no limit, all leg locks were allowed and all this sort of stuff. A lot of the big name jiu-jitsu people started dropping out. So a spot opened up. I got the opportunity to head over there. There was still a few big names. Obviously, Mario Sperry, again, I ended up catching up with, who also fought in that Cage Combat there. He actually won the inaugural ADCC over there and the super fight. I won my first match with heel hook. So I was the first ever heel hook submission in ADCC history, which is pretty cool. And then I lost my second match to BJ Penn's grappling coach. Just doing again, I was a novice, and I think I was the equivalent, of a 4-stripe white belt or possibly a blue belt back then. But still, we didn't have higher level guys, and I attempted a figure 4 inside Ceruto's guard with the goal of kind of trying to get him to go for the armbar so I could escape and pass, because I was having difficulty. But of course, he got the armbar, and I lost that. But again, it was a good experience. Competed in that first World Championships, and then kind of from there, the sport kind of died here and around Australia. I was supposed to fight in the second Cage Combat event, and they lined me up as a super fight against Tom Erickson. In hindsight, I'm kind of glad, because the guy was a freaking monster back then. But it just kind of died for about 2 years. And obviously the ADCC were kind of doing it a bit of an Olympic thing, so they disappeared for 2 years as well, because they didn't come back until 2000.
And that's the ADCC. That again was in Abu Dhabi.
Abu Dhabi, yes.
Yeah, so that's a long way to go. So that's a big commitment at the beginning, being a 4-stripe white belt. Like, just to highlight that, it's like 4-stripe white belt, jumping on a plane,
possibly a blue belt around that time,
flying to Abu Dhabi to compete in something that he doesn't even fully understand yet, after learning on VHS. Like, people need to understand that for a second, because people are passing around VHSs, traveling for training, and now the internet's blown it up and information's coming to us much faster. And there needs to be a recognition of, like, the sacrifices that people make to develop things quickly. Because I think even though the internet's here, it's nice that we're all getting the information, but we still need risk takers like yourself out of the next generation to go bring wrestling back to Australia and all these sorts of other things as well. So I think there's definitely some points there that you can learn from. So after Abu Dhabi, if that was when you were grappling, when did MMA really start to take off for you?
Well, as I said, I did that first ever MMA event in Australia. I did some shoot fighting. I got an opportunity to go to Japan to fight in rings. Again, I was kind of thrown in the deep end. I was fighting their biggest name and champion, Kiyoshi Tamura. And I was the big gaijin. They wanted to throw me in and get beat up. And again, it's the same thing. It was we had no idea what we were doing. We're pioneering the sport. I was learning my leg locks off VHS tapes. I still had Anthony Lange as my jiu-jitsu coach. So I was learning, fundamental jiu-jitsu and that. But he was only he was one belt higher than me. So while I was a white belt, he was a blue belt. When I got my blue, he was a purple. So, there was still a lot of self exploration and self-discovery of techniques. So, I'd watch these tapes and I'd go into class and I'd play with them and do them. And when I went to the rings match, I trained in grappling shin pads for the first, I fought in the grappling shin pads, which rings had, but I'd never done that before. So when I'd been training for this fight, I'd been training as if it was an MMA fight. And then I turned up and there's, no punching to the head. You can only do open hand strikes, no striking on the ground. And we had the shin pads on. And so during the match, my opponent kind of went for a leg lock. I went for a leg lock. He crossed his ankles. I went for a cross ankle, what's called a shoelace lock nowadays. And I cranked it on and it wasn't going on. And while I'm doing it, I left my leg across and he's reached across and gone for a cross ankle heel hook. And I ended up rope escaping it and not having to tap, but I actually tweaked one of my ligaments in my knee. And at the time, I didn't understand why this lock didn't work. And it wasn't until later on that I went back to Australia, trained with shin pads on, and realized the shin pads actually blocked the lock from working.
Yeah.
But again, it's one of those learning experiences. Also, one of the interesting things is earlier on in the match, I went for an armbar on Kiyoshi Tamura. He defended and I switched to back then what I termed a shin choke, which nowadays most people know as a Goga Plata. So I actually did the first Goga Plata in MMA as well, which he didn't tap for him, but he did do a rope escape, which again, in my opinion, is the same as a tap because you're basically going for the referee intervention to stop the submission. You're not escaping it. So again, another first for Australia there as well. From there, online, it was a little bit different than today because obviously today we have YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, so many different ways to connect. Back then, it was pretty much message boards and mailing lists. So from the mailing list, I hooked up. I got to know a few people, and there was these two guys. This guy named Pete, whose tag was Wino in the mailing list, and he was running this promotion called what was it called now? It later became TKO, which is the promotion that GSP came out of anyway. So they were holding events. They asked if I wanted to compete in their second event. They were going to have a light heavyweight tournament, and if I was keen to jump in, I'm like, yeah, absolutely, I'll jump in, no problems. And then about 2 weeks before the event, again, short notice, their main event had an accident, pulled out, no one wanted to take it. And they said, are you interested in jumping into a heavyweight title fight? I'm like, yeah, sure, what the hell, why not? So I flew out for there, got screwed over in the fight, so much so that they never actually released the video footage from it. It ended up going to a decision. I fought Dave Beneteau, another UFC veteran. I kicked the living crap out of his legs, and on one of his takedowns, his knee dislocated at the same time as I was going for a cutting armbar. And so I had his arm trapped. He was trying to drive in to block it, and his knee gives out while trying to defend it. And he screams, and the ref comes in, and I'm holding him like, oh, he's tapping. And So I let go, and the ref stopped it, and they said, "What's the problem?" And he's like, "Oh, I didn't tap from the armbar. My knee gave out." So they let him fix his knee up, and then they gave him 5 minutes or whatever to recover. And they said to him, "You go, do you want more time to recover?" And he goes, "Yeah, if I can have it." And they said, "Oh, if you have more time, you're going to lose the match." He goes, "All right, I'll continue then." And I'm like, "But he tapped." And they went, "No," because he was Canadian, and obviously we were in Canada. They kind of let the match go on, ended up going to a decision. And it ended up being a draw, so I never got that title, because it would have been Australia's first international world MMA title, so I kind of bit crushed on that one. And then that led to an opportunity to fight Frank Shamrock in K1. So Frank Shamrock, his promoter had contacted me even before this UCC, that's a Universal Combat Challenge title fight. He contacted me and said, "If given the opportunity, would you fight Frank Shamrock?" I'm like, "Oh, absolutely." And they said, "Look, we'll get back to you." And then I saw in the internet news pages, back then, adcombat.com was the #1 news source, that Frank Shamrock was trying to get a fight with either Kiyoshi Tamura or Yuki Kondo, one of the big name Japanese stars in one of the alternate promotions, to fight in K1 in an MMA match, because his goal was to win that and then get into K1, into Pride, because his goal was to fight Sakuraba in Pride. So he'd been challenging Sakuraba. So he went to K1, organized a match with them, tried to get one of the other big names to help him, and then at the last second, they were negotiating. Kiyoshi Tamura pulled out fairly early, and then Yuki Kondo was kind of agreeing, and then dropped out about a week before the event. And then a week before the K1 event, they called me and said, "Frank needs an opponent. Will you take it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." So I flew out to Japan, fought Frank on the 2000 GP final, which was an amazing experience. Got to meet some of the biggest names in the sport, Nestor Hust, Mirko Krokop, who I'd later meet in MMA, Stefan Liko, Ray Sefo. So I met all these guys, fought Frank, ended up going to a 5-round decision. And funnily enough, Frank's last fight before me had been Jeremy Horn, who he'd beaten in the UFC. And he basically said, "Look, if they ever offer you a fight with Jeremy, don't take it, because he's one of the most talented fighters out there. And if you beat him, you don't get any respect. And if you lose to him, you'll never get any respect." And I'm like, "Oh," he goes, "it's just a no-win situation," because he beat Jeremy, and he's like, "Look, I didn't get the respect I deserve. He was one of the most dangerous guys out there. He's very well-rounded." And then, funnily enough, about 2 months later, I get a call from the UFC saying, "Look, our co-main event has pulled out. We've got Jeremy Horn. We're looking for a fight. Are you interested in taking it?" And of course, I went, "What the hell? Why not?" And that's pretty much the start of where my career kind of took off with the UFC.
Yep, and you triangled Jeremy Horn, correct?
That is correct. It's kind of funny. There was, because I said the internet wasn't quite what it was today. So one of the news sources for MMA was this newspaper called Full Contact Fighter. So it actually came out in a newspaper format. So obviously we'd get it here in Australia, but we'd always get it about a month after it had been released. So it would have previews and breakdowns of the upcoming fights in the UFC and hook and shoot and some of the other smaller events. But we always got it late. Now, when I flew to the US to fight Jeremy in the UFC, I actually got my hands on a copy of their Full Contact Fighter before the actual event that I was fighting in. And in it, they had the fighter and coach predictions. So they did the main and co-main event. And interestingly enough, the main event was Tito versus Evan Tanner. And most of the predictions were split about 50-50. But the co-main, which was myself and Jeremy, every single person that predicted our fight said Jeremy would win by submission in under 3 minutes. When I read that, I said to myself, my goal is to beat him by submission in under 3 minutes. I triangle armbarred him in 2 minutes and 59 seconds. So Aussie know-how got it done in the end. It was kind of, look, I'll be honest, it was a little bit luck. Everything for this fight, because I only had about 10 to 14 days notice, all I did was train one single game plan. I knew what my strategy was. It was to kick with him, force him into the boxing range, pull guard, and then attack triangles and arm bars. And he literally did exactly what we kind of predicted. He fell into the game plan. I actually wanted the triangle armbar that I got at the end, which was a modified 2-arm in kind of triangle, which I think they call the dead orchard or something nowadays. Danaher calls it the dead Elvis because he says I did it first. It was kind of just a kind of a fly by the seat of my pants. At the time, I kind of adjusted to what was happening in there. But yeah, I got that submission, and it's also where my finger point call sign came up. I'm sitting there, and I'm getting pumped now. I'm getting the tingles just talking the story. I'm in the cage. I'm sitting there all nervous, waiting for them to lift my hand up. And while I'm sitting there looking around, just taking everything in, I look down, and right at my feet is this cameraman. He's looking up at me, camera's pointing at me, and I look straight down the barrel and I go, the finger point down the barrel of the camera. And the UFC saw that. They started using that when I ended up getting the title fight with Tito. They used it in their promo for that. They ended up putting it at the end of the montage on their first UFC video game. So, pretty much the finger point, it's good to be the king, kind of stuck with me ever since.
That's cool. And realistically, I think your story, this is what I love about this story the most. You joined because you saw the UFC on a tape. And what's happening now around the world is still a very similar story. Kids, adults, young men are joining and starting martial arts because they watched UFC on the weekend. And I think that's good.
To be a little bit more accurate, I actually started martial arts because I was a shy kid. I was a little bit bullied, and I wanted to kind of get self-confidence up. So that's why I kind of got into the martial arts. The reason I actually took the first ever fight was because I saw the UFC, but it was more about a personal journey. I only ever intended to do one match. The reason is I'd done martial arts for years. I did it to kind of build confidence and to be able to defend myself from bullies. But I never really got into any altercations after I kind of really got training. I did, early on in primary school, but that was still early. So I actually went into this first event with the goal of just seeing if I had the courage to actually fight. What would happen? A lot of times we practice in the gym, and when you're confronted with a situation where it's kind of life or death sort of thing, I wanted to know, would I fold or would I rise to the occasion? And then on top of that, on top of the mental aspect, I wanted to know, did the skills I've been learning in the gym actually translate to a real fighting situation? So really it was just about a self-test. And what kind of drove me on to kind of keep going was the crowd. It's like that first time I walked into there, the place just absolutely erupted. There was like 5,000 people, which is pretty crazy for a first ever event in Australia. It was just cheering, and I was the Aussie against the Canadian guy, and the place, and it was just electric. And then when I won the match, interesting is when I walked into the cage, there was just noise and sounds and lights, and everything was just so distracting. But as soon as that gate clanged shut, I still remember the noise, the clang it makes, it shuts. Everything just went, and the only thing I could see straight down was the guy opposite me. I didn't even notice the referee. The crowd disappeared, and it was just like I had this single-minded determination, this focus, and my goal was to beat this guy. And then as soon as the match stopped, everything just went whoosh out again as the crowd erupted, and the chanting and cheering. And it was just such an amazing experience. And it was kind of that's what kind of drove me onwards to keep going. It's like I'd achieved what I'd wanted out of it from a personal goal perspective. I'd found out that I was capable of doing. I found out that my skills translated across, but then I actually found I enjoyed the crowd and the rush and the excitement of competing, and it kind of kept going. Interesting point, the guy I beat in that first match, Matt Rocker, sitting in his corner was a little-known fighter known as Frank Shamrock, which is kind of funny. It's kind of amazing just how many times in the different situations I've been that I'm kind of reconnecting with people, like having Frank in that corner and then facing Frank later on, Frank having fought Jeremy and then me fighting Jeremy, me meeting Mario Sperry at the cage combat event and then meeting Mario Sperry at ADCC, and I ended up later on when competing at the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu World Championships. I ended up going to train with Mario and the ATT guys, BTT guys back then in Brazil. So it's pretty kind of cool, and you kind of look at all these threads as both the jiu-jitsu, the no-gi, and the MMA all kind of connect together.
Yeah, it's good, and I like that. I love the fact that you started it for wanting to do martial arts, and I love the idea of testing yourself as a martial artist, because I think MMA is the best set of rules we have currently to be able to do that, whether you're a jiu-jitsu fighter or not. So I really like those, and you've obviously done a whole heap of Muay Thai training and all that kind of stuff as well, and then understanding why you did it yourself, which is important, because people need to have a why they want to do these things. They need to understand why they want to go to the gym and try this UFC thing. Like, what is it? What gap are you trying to fill in your life when you go to the gym? What's something that you love about passing on to your students about martial arts? What's so intoxicating about being a coach for you?
I mean, obviously, it's been able to take my experience and my knowledge and what I've done and help other people. Obviously, it's really cool when I'm able to create other champions, and I've created numerous Australian Jiu-Jitsu and MMA champions. But what really gets me, and it's one of the reasons I was really drawn to martial arts is, and I'm sure you're the same, I didn't start this business to help people. I didn't start this business to make money, but I have to make money to survive. I started this because I loved teaching and passing on knowledge, and I just love helping people. I just love the idea that I can help someone, and it's usually the people who a lot of other people won't remember that I've helped that really mean the most. Because there are champions that I have come through here that I've built up. They're phenomenal athletes and competitors. But the reality is these are the sort of guys that could go to pretty much any gym and succeed. And if you look at any of the top gyms, their fighters would most likely succeed at any other high-level gym as long as they're getting in a kind of an equivalent training. Like, everyone's going to say, oh, my training's better, or we have something that the others don't. But the reality is high-level training is very similar, and what is usually different is the individual. High-level guys and champions will succeed anywhere because they have that drive and determination. It is the average person that comes in that wants to improve their health, improve their confidence, seeing kids come in here who are being bullied to turn it around to build self-confidence, and then seeing their school grades improve because their self-confidence from being bullied has improved. So that's really kind of what drives me. I love seeing that change through just my normal students, seeing them come in here, how much they enjoy coming to training, how it's an escape from the struggles and difficulties of life. And it's just a place where they can come, where they are accepted regardless of who they are, just for being who they are. So they can come in here, they can be themselves, they get to train with other people. We are all equals on the mat. Well, depending on your belt level, of course, but we're all equals. in training. You know, we're all out there to achieve our personal goals, and we do it together. It's one of the things I say is fighting is an individual sport that only succeeds on the shoulders of others. I cannot be a great martial artist if I do not have great training partners. And I think sometimes people forget that. And I like to remind my guys that we are successful because of the people around us, and building that culture, that environment, just a place that people are happy to coming through really keeps me coming every week. Like, as I said, I could have stayed in IT. I'd be probably financially better off, or at least very similar, without the amount of hours. I spend like a ridiculous amount of hours because it's my own business, and it's what's expected of me. I own the business. If I want it to be successful, I've got to put in the time. But I could be an employee and not spend that time and be just as financially well off. But I love doing it, and I keep coming back, and I keep putting myself, my money back into it, and seeing people improve their lives is just motivating, and it keeps me going every single time.
Yeah, it's good, and you're right about, like, I mean, those champions will excel anywhere. But the one thing you can do is teach ordinary people to start thinking more like a champion.
Yes,
you know?
give them a champion mindset.
Yeah, because I love that, and I actually my favorite thing isn't the next wonderful, athletic, well-disciplined person that comes in. It's actually that person that comes in that might be a little bit weak, a little bit confused, and they slowly but surely start to change their habits and become strong. You know, like, I mean, that's the whole idea, not to take other strong people and make them stronger, you know, which you can do, but it's much more.
And I do, and I'm happy to do that. And, you know, I still want to help those people, but you're right. It's the everyday person who needs the help, that it's so much more rewarding when they use the help and they improve and they're able to take what you've given them.
Yeah, 100%. I love that, and I do follow your gym online. I have like a little dream of myself of making sure that I have a full size cage and a full size ring. At the moment, I squeeze like a 5-meter ring out the back somewhere that lives outdoors, and then I have a 7-meter cage, and then a little bit of mat space and conditioning gear. But you've got a great setup there at King's Academy in Sydney. The mat space is ginormous. And it's
I think we have the largest single professional mat space in Australia, so that's pretty cool. Again, it was one of my goals when I set this place up. Obviously, I'd been to the US and I'd seen the facilities there, and it was important for me to try and bring back what I saw over there and bring it here. So, you know, cage, a ring, a massive mat space. We have a yoga room. We have strength and conditioning. Hyperbaric oxygen chamber, ice bath, sauna. So what I kind of understood probably later in my career rather than earlier, but it's just as important to have the recovery along with the training. So a big goal for me was to ensure my facility had both training and recovery, because if you want to get the most out of people, you want to make sure they're able to recover so that they get the most out of their own sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've done a great job of doing that. Now, just before we finish up today, Elvis,
Sure.
I always like to give everybody a little bit of help along the way. What would be one of the best bits of advice that you would give somebody who wanted to start martial arts today?
Look, honestly, it's just go and do it. I mean, just go to a club, pick one, do a trial. If you like it, jump in. If you don't, go to another club, do a trial. Find a place that fits, that you kind of feel comfortable in, and don't worry about how hard the training is. Don't worry if you can't do the techniques. If you could do it, you wouldn't need us. This is what I try and tell people. Come in, find somewhere you're comfortable, start training. One of the most important things to my success is routine. Make it a habit. Once it's a habit, you do it. So, you know, you get up, you go, okay, today is jiu-jitsu day. I put my jiu-jitsu gi in the bag. Then, you know, Friday comes, Friday's my jiu-jitsu day. I turn up, I make sure I go every single time, regardless how I feel. Once it becomes a routine, you start doing it. Once you start doing it regularly, then you start seeing results, and results is probably the greatest motivating factor for anyone. once you start seeing results, it drives you to keep going. If you are not consistent and have that routine early on, you're not going to see the results. And it doesn't matter whether it's soccer, whether it's martial arts, whether it's going to the gym. Routine and consistency is what is going to give you what you need to keep going later on.
I love that. That's great advice. Thanks for joining me today, Elvis.
Always a pleasure.
I do like hearing the origin story, and there are going to be some of my students that take that advice on board, and hopefully maybe even somebody watched today that's been thinking about doing martial arts, and we get them into it. Thanks, mate. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, no problems. Been a pleasure. I've got a lot more stories, so hopefully down the track we can do a follow-up one. And as I always like to finish off, it's good to be the king.
Thank you. That's awesome.